Okay, we're recording. So we're working on module 2 today, computer forensic investigation process. So the module objectives are understanding forensic investigation process and its importance, understanding pre-investigation phase, understanding investigation phase, and then post-investigation phase. And apparently they just really like to get fancy and change things up. So first thing we're going to do is the understanding the forensic investigation process and its importance. So when they're talking about the forensic investigation process, this is a methodological approach to investigate, seize, and analyze digital evidence, and then manage the case from the time of search and seizure to reporting the investigation results. So a lot of people originally just think, oh, they just think about that middle part. They don't think about the search and seizure and the report section. So don't forget that's also part of it. So what's the importance of this forensic investigation process? As digital evidence is fragile in nature, following strict guidelines and thorough forensic investigation process that ensures the integrity of evidence is critical to prove a case in the court of law. Forensic investigation process to be followed should comply with local laws and established precedents. Any breach or deviation may jeopardize the complete investigation. And that's because if you have a breach or you deviate from it, they can throw out, say, a key piece of evidence, and that's the foundation for your case. And there you go, there goes your whole case. Investigators must follow a repeatable and well-documented set of steps, such that every iteration of analysis provides the same findings, else the findings of the investigation can be invalidated during the cross-examination in a court of law. So remember me talking about the scientific process? You have to be able to document everything, and it has to be repeatable. So what are the phases involved in forensic investigation process? We have the pre-investigation phase, and this deals with the tasks to be performed prior to the commencement of the actual investigation. This involves setting up computer forensics labs, building your workstations, developing your investigation toolkit, setting up an investigation team, and getting all your relevant authority approvals. During the investigation phase, which is the main phase of the computer forensics investigation process, this involves the acquisition, preservation, and analysis of evidentiary data to identify the source of the crime and the culprit behind it. Now, the post-investigation phase, this is where you do all your documentation, write all your reports. So documentation of all your actions undertaken and the findings uncovered during your investigation. And it ensures that the report is easily explicable to the target audience and that it provides adequate and acceptable evidence. So what they mean there is you can write a super scientific paper-like report, which is great, but you can't expect someone who is not a forensic investigator to be able to read and understand that. You have to write your reports to the audience. Okay. Forensic investigation, pre-investigation phase. Yeah, you have to dumb it down. And usually you have to think about who you're presenting those reports to. Oftentimes, when you write forensic reports, they have multiple iterations of the same data. They have one that's for peers, and that's like the people you work with, and that's uses all the acronyms and everything that you would use yourself. And then they have one that's for knowledgeable people that are not quite up to your level. And then they have one that's for like the average person off the street. And if you can learn how to write to those 3 levels really well, you can be very sought after just to write the reports, because writing documentation itself is difficult, and learning how to write it properly at all 3 levels is a great skill to have. Okay. setting up a computer forensic lab. So this is actually really cool and it's a lot of fun. And it can be incredibly expensive, or you can make certain things depending on your budget. There are some really cool little things you can get in there that can drop the cost, but also give you a lot of functionality. So when they talk about a CFL, well, that's a computer forensic lab. And that's just your location that houses your instruments, software and hardware tools, forensic workstations required for conducting computer-based investigations with regard to collected evidence. So there are 6 stages. There is the planning and budgeting consideration. You have to figure out how many cases you're expected to come through, type of investigations, manpower, equipment and software requirements. So if you're doing a small forensic lab and you only do, say, maybe 100, 200 cases, which is quite small, if you're only doing computer forensics, I should say, and you specialize in one particular area, let's say intellectual property theft, you can specialize your equipment, and you can specialize your workstations and the type of people that you hire, so that changes the planning and budgeting considerations. Now, physical and structural design considerations, you have to consider your lab size. You don't want to make a lab that's got 5 stations if you only have funds for 2 people, you know. But at the same time, if you're going to have a massive amount of work come through and you only have 2 stations, it's going to clog things up very quickly. You have to have access to what are considered your essential services. You have to have space estimates for work areas and evidence storage. You have to have heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Now, I'm going to give you a little section here on evidence storage. Because I was involved in, my previous position for the state police was forensic evidence specialist. I was taught and had to teach cops, lawyers, judges, how to package, store, and process evidence so that it made it, you know, complete through the court of law, basically. So there are certain types of evidence that you have to have a temperature controlled environment for. You know, for us, we're not dealing with refrigerator systems because we're not dealing with like biologicals like blood or urine, but at the same time, you can't be working, and if you're going to be using servers, in a space that gets horrendously overheated, because you need those stations to stay cool, right? So you have to have proper ventilation, heating that's good enough to keep you and stuff from melting or freezing solid, and air conditioning that's going to make sure that you keep all of your instruments at proper working conditions. When you store evidence, you have to have special locked, like we had a vault, actually we had a couple of vaults, and we had limited access. There were only 2 people that were allowed into the one, and then anybody who wanted anything out of that, we had to accompany them into it and sign them in and out. I mean, it gets very complicated, but there's a reason for that. It's that chain of custody and, you know, tampering and things like that. So remember that when you're talking about evidence storage, if you do a lot of cases and you're going to have to store computers, cell phones, hard drives, you need to have a locked, secure area, and it needs to be, you know, properly air conditioned and everything else. So that has to be considered as well. Now, your work area considerations, these are like workstation requirements. They're different they're similar to what you would use with like an office workstation, but you have to have, usually you have to have more surface area because sometimes you have to tear computers apart. So you have to have a bit more tabletop abilities, you know, more space so you can pull up a computer and take stuff out of it. You have to have good lighting systems. You need to have uninterrupted power supplies. You need to have a very high internet and network communication system. You need to make sure everything is solid and that you have backups, right? Next, physical security considerations. This one, you know, I harp on this one. Everyone always forgets when you're talking about cybersecurity, we mean physical security too. So you want to do electronic sign-ins, intrusion alarm systems, and fire suppression systems. Because any type of building that you work with, you really should have this in there, especially if you're doing anything that has to deal with legal work. You need, you probably should do the, they call them man traps. Do you remember what man traps are, where you have the two doors and you stick the person between the two doors and you have to have either credentials or they have to talk to you in order to get in. And you have to have logbooks and all sorts of other things like that. Next, we have human resource considerations. So how many people are you going to need? What kind of training and certifications are you going to need? That's what's going to come up there. And then lastly, forensic lab licensing. The two big ones there, that's ASCLD Lab, and yes, that is how that's pronounced, accreditation, and ISO IEC accreditation. Now, the top one, they're the big ones for international and national forensic labs. They're the ones that have everything for like your forensic evidence and handling. They're the ones that I was an auditor. I was an internal auditor for them. And then we did yearly audits just to go through and be like, yes, we're staying up with these. And then every 5 years we had external audits, and that's usually what you have to go through. And ISO and IEC are usually linked to your safety and equipment. And then, of course, don't forget, you also have to deal with OSHA. Okay, are there any questions on this? It can be a lot of fun to set one of these up. If you're only doing, like, I'll give you an example. I only had very minimal cases that came in when I worked at the school district, but because I had a forensic background, they allowed me to basically build my own forensic workstation. And that way they didn't have to outsource anything. It was kind of nice because I was just basically given you tell us what you need and we'll work with the budget type thing. And if you have a forensics background, I highly suggest, if you're interested, honestly, I think the test for it's easier than the CEH. It's called the CHFI, the Computer Hacking Forensic Investigator. That's through EC Council. And it's a lot of the same stuff that you're learning here. Excuse me. Next, we have building the investigation team. So you need to keep your team small because you have to protect confidentiality of investigations to guard against information leaks. You have to identify team members and assign them responsibilities, and then ensure that every team member has the necessary clearance and authorization to conduct assigned tasks, and assign one team member as the technical lead for the investigation. So also remember, when you're dealing with a lot of this stuff, you need to have people go through background checks before they can even get their hands on this or even get assigned to these. If they aren't doing that step, and someone goes in and works on this evidence, when they come back, defense comes back and says, who worked on this? Who is this John Doe? Then they say, oh, it's this new guy. We haven't done his security clearances. We haven't checked his background, or they can have everything thrown out, right? All right, so what type of people are involved in an investigation team. So there's a photographer, and some of these can often be like combined together. This person photographs the crime scene and the evidence gathered. Incident responders, these are responsible for measures to be taken when an incident occurs. Incident analyzer, these analyze the incident based on their occurrence. Evidence examiner and investigators, those are your core team members there. They examine the evidence acquired and sort the useful evidence. Evidence documenter, they document all the evidence and the phases present in the investigation process. Evidence manager, they manage the evidence in such a way that it's admissible in a court of law. Evidence witness offers a formal opinion in the form of testimony in the court of law. And then attorneys provide legal advice. Now, usually they have an attorney on retainer that they work with. Now, a lot of times the evidence witness, documenter, and examiner can be folded into the same one, just depending on the type of things that they do. Photographer, responder, and analyzer can be folded in. It just depends on their areas of expertise. Any questions on this? Okay. Excuse me. Hardware and software requirements for a forensic lab. So, digital forensic labs should have all the necessary hardware and software tools to support the investigation process, starting from searching and seizing the evidence to reporting the outcome of the analysis. So for hardware, you need 2 or more forensic workstations with good processing power and RAM. And by that, they mean, you know how they have those minimum requirements for video games? Don't do that. A lot of times forensic tools require a significant amount of RAM and processing power just to run. So my rule of thumb is to max out your processing and RAM as much as possible. Specialized cable, a lot of times the cables need to be, you'll get weird things that you'll have to have specialty cables to hook into. Or you'll have to use things like write blockers and drive duplicators, and some of those require specialty cables. Now, do you guys know what they're talking about with write blockers and drive duplicators? Yes, no?
Isn't it for securing volatile data?
Yes. So a write blocker and a drive duplicator, they can be the same team or they can be 2 separate pieces of hardware. What they are is they allow you to take a hard drive or sometimes the mobile device, depending on whatever it is. And when you copy a drive the regular way, it causes you to change the drive that it comes from. It doesn't matter what you do. It's just part of Windows. It'll cause changes to the hard drive. Well, if you do that, then it changes the hard drive, which means it's not a forensic copy. So in order to create a forensic copy, you have what are called write blockers, which allow you to write block the source, and that way you're copying from it, but you're not changing anything on that hard drive or device. So those are a key part of the hardware that you need for a forensic lab. Archive and restore devices, media sterilization systems. Also, sometimes you'll have to use those. They're one of my favorite things because SSDs, you really can't fully erase those. You have to destroy them. So if you have to have things that you need to, at end of life, destroy, they have these, they look like a giant hole punch basically, but for hard drives. And they have these teeth that just, depending on the model, you put this little, like little brick looking thing in and you chomp down on it and it punches through the processors and stuff on the hard drive and destroys it. It's actually pretty nifty looking. Media sterilization system for things that you can do that with. Other equipment that allow forensic software tools to work. Computer forensic hardware tools, such as Parabin's first responder bundle, Deep Spar, Disk Imager, Fred Forensic Workstation, etc. I'll go out and we can look at some of these after. Yeah, you can do, if you really want to, you can do incinerators. I actually had a major that was over forensics that used to joke about if that machine doesn't work, I'm going to put a 40 millimeter port in it, because he had a 40 millimeter Glock, and one of the machines for blood alcohol was temperamental as heck. So that was his joke, was that he was going to put a 40 millimeter port in it. So I totally understand that. Okay, software, operating systems, data discovery tools, password cracking tools, acquisition tools, data analyzers, data recovery tools, specialty file viewers, file type conversion tools, security and utility software, and then there's forensic software tools. Access data, FTK, is actually really cool, and I can guarantee at some point you will, of course, be using Wireshark. All right, next, forensic investigation phase. So, what is computer forensic investigation methodology? This is a really good slide to keep. So, this is a start to finish, follow the arrows thing, documenting the electronic crime scene. Now, when they say that, one thing that is often misunderstood, it doesn't mean touching the computer first. Take pictures of the computer, the ports that are used. You have to look at the area, because a lot of times if you're dealing with someone who knows how to do criminal things, they'll have stuff that's hidden. So if you can't remember what port it was plugged into, or you can't remember what went where because you didn't document, that can be an issue. So remember that, documenting the crime scene. Search and seizure, evidence preservation, data acquisition, data analysis, case analysis, report, and then testifying as an expert witness. Now, I do have a question for you guys. One thing that we used to do before you were allowed to testify in a court of law was do a mock court trial. Would you guys be interested in doing that over Zoom at some point, just for fun? Like, I would assign someone to be prosecution, and then we'd have people on the jury, we'd have the judge, well, I'd be the judge. Then we'd have like expert witnesses, and I could walk you through. Oh, it wouldn't be right now. It would be like towards week 6 or 7. Okay, because a lot of people don't get to do those. I'm surprised, but a lot of people don't get to do those. So we'll talk about doing one of those later in the class. All right, documenting the electronic crime scene. So documentation of the crime scene is necessary to maintain a record of all forensic investigation processes performed to identify, extract, analyze, and preserve evidence. Points to remember when documenting the crime scene. Document the physical crime scene, noting the position of the system and other equipment, if any. There usually is. Even printers. I know that sounds weird, but people have done ingeniously things that seem dumb to us. But if you're hiding things in your printer, and the person who's like doing the investigation documentation doesn't take pictures of that, when you do reports and stuff, they're going to be like, well, how can you prove that that's where that was? So remember that. Document details of any related or difficult to find electronic components. See what I mean? Record the state of computer system, digital storage media, and electronic devices, including their power status. Search and seizure. So there are rules in the US for search and seizure. Planning the search and seizure. Seek consent. Obtain witness signatures. Obtain a warrant for search and seizure. You can't just walk off with stuff without a warrant. Collect incident information. Now, these are different if you are working for a company, because usually there is a use agreement that you have to sign as an employee, which basically says, this is our equipment, not yours. We can take it whenever we want to. So you don't need to do that. You can just walk off with it in that case. However, I suggest if you're doing forensic stuff for a company, you take pictures of everything around it, because people can be just as sneaky in their work environment as they are at home. Initial search of the scene, securing and evaluating the crime scene, seizing evidence at the crime scene. Make sure you deal with how it's powered on or powered off, the computers. Deal with the networked components. Operating system shutdown procedures. Don't just yank the power cord. This is why they have digital forensic experts, so people don't do this. Dealing with mobile and handheld devices. Remember how I talked about volatile data? A lot of things on mobile devices are volatile data. So putting them in a Faraday cage, which allows no signals in or out, and then keeping them powered until you get to a sterile environment is often the way to go. It depends on how it's stored and what programs they're using. There are specialty programs that when you shut down the phone, it encrypts things, and then you're SOL if the person's not going to cooperate. So it really just depends on what they're doing with their phone. Okay, planning the search and seizure. There should be a search and seizure plan, and it should contain description of the incident, case name or title of the incident, location of the incident, applicable jurisdiction and relevant legislation, determining the extent of authority to search. I'll explain that in a second. Creating a chain of custody document, details of equipment to be seized, seizure and seizure type, overt or covert, approval from local management, health and safety precautions. If you're seizing equipment from a meth lab, that's going to greatly change how you do things versus the average home. So applicable jurisdiction and relevant legislation. So that's is this a local police department? Is this a state police department? Is this a federal case? Relevant legislation may have to deal with things like, is this medical records, stuff like that. Extent of authority to search. So there are things like just cause, and there's what's called the in sight or plain sight rule when it comes to warrants. And that is, if you've served a warrant, you have to be very particular about what it says you can and can't remove on that search warrant. It will tell you where you can search. Some of them are pretty broad, and they're like any electronic devices, in which case you can go to town and get anything in the residence that's an electronic device. Any electronic device, any electronic peripherals. Some of them will say only those in view on such and such area, in which case you literally cannot take anything else that is not in plain view. So know what your warrant states. Evidence preservation. Evidence preservation refers to the proper handling and documentation of evidence to ensure that it is free from any contamination. Any physical and or digital evidence seized should be isolated, secured, transported, and preserved to protect its true state. At the time of evidence transfer, both the sender and receiver need to provide information about the date and time of transfer in the chain of custody record. The procedures used to protect the evidence and document it while collecting and shipping are as follows. Logbook of the project, a tag to uniquely identify any evidence, and a chain of custody record. Have I shown you guys what a chain of custody record looks like? Yay, nay? Have I shown you guys? Way back. Okay, I thought I did. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and I'll go pull one up for you. Oh, look, NIST has a sample one now. Nifty. All right. So this is NIST from NIST, and it's an example. Excuse me. Property record number that usually has to deal with, that's like your internal one. And then you have everything on the top. So this is what they were talking about with your information that you need there. And when you're dealing with computers and things like that, you want to get pretty detailed. And then you can see your chain of custody down here. Now, a lot of times, if you're doing multiple items and they're not attached to each other, they will get separate evidence tracking forms. And then they'll have, each of them have their own item numbers. They can be the same case number, but they need to have a unique item number. Because if you don't have a unique item number, you can't track each of those in and of their own. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Next, data acquisition. So forensic data acquisition is a process of imaging or collecting information from various media in accordance with certain standards for analyzing its forensic value. Investigators can then forensically process and examine the collected data. Remember, never work on the original, use a forensic copy to extract information relevant to any particular case or incident while protecting the integrity of the data. It is one of the most critical steps of digital forensics, as improper acquisition may alter data or in evidence media and render it inadmissible in the court of law. Remember, I was talking about right blockers. That's why they use them. Investigators should be able to verify the accuracy of acquired data, and the complete process should be auditable and acceptable in the court of law. And remember, not only should it be auditable, but it should be repeatable. So, data analysis. Data analysis refers to the process of examining, identifying, separating, converting, and modeling data to isolate useful information. Data analysis techniques depend on the scope of the case or client's requirements. This phase includes the following: analysis of file contents, date and time of file creation and modification, users associated with file creation, access and file modification, and physical storage location of the file. Timeline generation, identification of root cause of the incident. Case analysis. Investigators can relate the evidential data to the case details for understanding how the complete incident took place and determining future actions, such as the following: determining the possibility of exploring other investigative procedures to gather additional evidence, e.g. checking host data and examining network service logs for any information of evidentiary value, collecting case-specific evidence from social media, identifying remote storage locations, etc. Gather additional information related to the case, aliases, email accounts, ISP used, names, network configurations, system logs, passwords, by interviewing the respective individuals. Consider the relevance of components that are out of the scope of the investigation. For example, equipment like laminators, check paper, scanners, and printers in case of any fraud, or digital cameras in case of child pornography. Next, post-investigation phase. Gathering and organizing your information. So, identification. Documentation in each phase should be identified to decide whether it is appropriate to the investigation and should be organized in specific categories. Procedures. Following are the procedures for gathering and organizing required documentation. So gather all your notes from different phases of the investigation process, identifying the facts to be included in the report for supporting the conclusions, list all the evidence to submit with the report, list the conclusions that need to be in the report, organize and classify the information gathering to create a concise and accurate report. So, writing the investigation report. The report writing is a crucial stage in the outcome of the investigation. The report should be, excuse me, clear. Hold on. Sorry about that. Should be clear, concise, and written for the appropriate audience. Important aspects of a good report. It should accurately define the details of the incident. It should convey all necessary information in a concise manner. It should be technically sound and understandable to the target audience. It should be structured in a logical manner so that information can be easily located. It should be able to withstand legal inspection. It should adhere to local laws to be admissible in court. Not just local, depending on what level of legal, you might be local, you might be state, you might be federal. So, those are different court admissible sections. So, forensic investigation report templates. So it contains the following. You have your executive summary, and this is especially important for people who do not understand a lot of forensics. Case number, names and social security numbers of the authors, investigators, and examiners. You don't put your social security numbers in if you're examiners, unless it's like a federal case. Usually you just have to put your whole name in. Purpose of the investigation, significant findings, signature analysis. What are the investigation objectives? Details of the incidents. Date and time the incident allegedly occurred. Date and time the incident was reported to the agency's personnel. Details of the person or persons reporting the incident. Then there's the investigation process. Date and time the investigation was assigned. Who were the investigators? And the nature of the claim and information provided to the investigators. So, a lot of the times when we get those reports, when companies are like, oh, we were hacked and millions of user data was released, but this was a year ago. That's why they talk about when the incident occurred and when it was reported. That's why you have to make those separate steps. Continuation here. For evidence information, location of the evidence, list of collected evidence, what kind of tools were involved when you collected the evidence, and what was done to preserve the evidence. Evaluation analysis process, the initial evaluation of the evidence, what investigative techniques were used, and analysis of the computer of evidence. So they want to know what tools, hardware and software were involved when you did that. Relevant findings, supporting files, attachments and appendices, full paths and important files, of the important files, expert reviews and opinions, other supporting details, attacker methodology, user applications and internet activity, and recommendations. Testifying as an expert witness. I will tell you, it doesn't matter who you are, you can guarantee that you will be nervous the first time. It's just part of being human. Presenting digital evidence in court requires knowledge of new, specialized, evolving, and sometimes complex technology. So, what are the things that take place in your courtroom? Familiarize the expert witness with the usual procedures that are followed during trial. The attorney introduces your witness. The opposing counsel may try to discredit the witness. The attorney leads the expert witness through the evidence, and later it is followed by the opposing counsel's cross-examination. Now, usually, I'll tell you how this went with me. what I did as a forensic evidence specialist was almost always I had to testify about chain of custody. So they would introduce me. You'd have to spell your name. You'd have to be sworn in. You'd have to introduce yourself. You'd have to talk about any professional, what do you call them? Not agencies, organizations that you belong to. I will say that the more of them that you belong to, the more it leads to your being listed as a credible witness. So you lead those in, you tell them, if you have a degree, you tell them when you got it, you tell them about your organizations. You cannot look at your notes unless you say, I can't remember that, may I reference whatever documentation. You do have the right to ask for that. Because sometimes you can be called on cases that are years down the road, and there's no way you're going to remember that. You have to brush up on it beforehand, and then you have to have the ability to look at stuff during a trial. And then they may try to go after your credentials. That never happened to me. Then the attorney will lead you through questions, and then you get cross-examined. I will say I had one particularly bad experience where I was asked the same question repeatedly, and instead of the prosecutor standing up and saying, asked and answered, and objecting like they should, they just sat there. And that was really uncomfortable because I had to basically repeat the same thing over and over again. And you have to be, they were trying to get me to snap and do things. And later I asked the attorney, why didn't you do that? Oh, well, I figured you were handling it just fine by yourself. And I was very angry. Excuse me. So, just like any other job, sometimes you get not so much fun people to work with on both sides. Sorry, my cough is just irritated by me talking. So, next. So we just have our module summary here. So what did we talk about? Investigation process and its importance. It covered various activities involved in pre-investigation phase, investigation phase, and post-investigation phase. And the next one, we'll talk about hard disks and file system. That'll be next week. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then we'll talk about where we're going to go for the rest of the week. Let me stop the recording.